Now I am so pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Judith Goldstein. She received a bachelor's degree from Cornell University in 1962 with a concentration on European and American history. In 1972, Judith completed her doctoral studies at Columbia University after writing her dissertation on The Politics of Ethnic Pressure, the American Jewish Committee Fight Against Immigration Restriction, 1906 to 1917. This work was the beginning of a sustained concentration on immigration and diversity in America and Europe. In the late 1980s, she worked as the executive director of Thanks to Scandinavia, started by the Danish pianist Victor Borge to acknowledge Scandinavians who resisted Nazism and protected Jews during the Second World War. In 1997, Judith founded Humanity in Action and began to serve as its executive director, where she remains today. Welcome, Judith.
Thank you. I want to apologize ahead of time. You may hear wrestling papers, but that's because I'm going to read this talk to you. And as I move from page to page, you might hear it, but I apologize. But the topic is so is so difficult to deal with that I want to be very careful about everything that I say. So let me start off by thanking the Utah Council for Citizen Diplomacy for providing this opportunity for all of us to think about race and nationalism. The organizers have put together two enormous topics in a way that is really quite provocative, challenging, and even jarring. To think about race by itself and nationalism by itself is an enormous task. But now I need to join them. And not easy for all of us to think about. And not particularly easy or comfortable in these fractured and unsettled times for this country and for so many others in Europe. And then to make the challenge even greater, the authors of this conference have asked for a broad international perspective on the two topics. Well, let me begin with framing the geographical contours of this inquiry. My focus is on the US and Europe. I do not mean to imply that race and nationalism are unimportant in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. They are, but I confess to having such limited knowledge that I would probably mislead you if I attempted to include them. In the past 500 or 600 years, populations in Europe and the US have had much experience with the intertwining forces of race and nationalism. The combination seems obvious to us now, as they were built into powerful systems of governing and historical memory. But they are creations that satisfy human needs for making and sustaining identity and community, power, hierarchy and wealth, religion, and secular systems and beliefs. We invented concepts of race and nationalism, and we're stuck with them. At this moment, I think race is the most volatile and the dangerous idea of the two, an idea that is so strong that it continues to jolt the foundations of our societies. The tensions are so deep that they frequently defy reality and truth. The dangerous explosion of false news and conspiracy theories circulating on the internet and television and radio takes much of its strength from racism and nationalism. In this regard, the distortions of truth, the distortion is not new. It's just the mega rapidity and reach of dissemination. Humans invented the concept of race. They use it to exploit other human beings, to gain profit, and to justify war after war. We now know that categorizing people by race is unscientific and wrong, especially as it is used as a tool of oppression and violence. But it's baked into our Western history. What do you do when the term has been proven to be scientifically bogus, but the impact remains powerful and a critical part of what we are, or of who we are. Race is, semantically speaking, meaningless, but almost eternal in our cultures and histories. In countries like France and Germany, race is a forbidden word and category for academic and governmental investigations into the workings of those societies. Employing the word is poisonous, and yet the poison remains deep in the system and the behaviors of our societies. We finally come to the time that denial of and ignorance about race are no longer valid options. Oppression produced twisted and deformed national narratives that mostly serve those in power. They continue for all too many to inform contemporary beliefs. The fundamental contest continues between those who cling to race and sustain hierarchies, those who have power and control over the resources of a society, versus those who are discriminated against and who seek equity in the name of democracy and pluralism. I wrote my doctoral dissertation, The Politics of Ethnic Pressure, in the early 1970s. It focused on immigration history, specifically the escape of Eastern European Jews to the US in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Their presence in America caused a significant backlash among white Anglo-Saxon Americans, who by the 1920s restricted immigration from all countries except white Western European nations. The white Protestant custodians of national identity defined America in terms of race, and not just in terms or in regard to Blacks and to Asians, but Eastern European Jews, Italians, and Slavs. I was totally focused on anti-Semitism, which seemed to me to be beyond the reach of racism. For that reason, I ignored the relevant history of slavery, the Civil War, Jim Crow, and its tendrils across America. If I were researching and rewriting today, I would have to address these issues in a totally different manner. Let me explain further. My narrative centered on the contest between Anglo-Saxon identity and pluralism, between the Protestant establishment and American Jews who perceived the United States as a refuge for the oppressed in Europe. The late 19th and early 20th century history now must be understood not only in terms of traditional anti-Semitism and resistance to it, but also within the multifaceted global forces of colonialism and anti-Black and anti-Asian radical ideologies. By the late 19th century, white nations openly prided themselves as progressive, post-Enlightenment, scientifically based societies built on a Darwinian survival of the fittest and a hierarchical order, ordained order of races. Cloaked in robust nationalism, white nations rapaciously acquired new wealth and conquered overseas lands. Racism anointed itself with the scientific name of eugenics. The result was the multifaceted formulation of racial theories and studies. They provided a spurious body of thought and prejudice to underlie discriminatory legal and illegal means. They sustained Jim Crow in the US South, reinforced practices of segregation in northern and western states, and restricted immigration in the country as a whole. Race was ever present, residing within the physical boundaries of America, as well as Australia and Canada. American racism, in particular, was cloaked in the language of democratic ideals and practices. The sacred right of self-governance was allotted to racists and to nationalists. They hoarded the benefits of their democracy for white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males. Their assumption of power and governing was justified through the lens of inferior primitive peoples, Native Americans, Blacks who were brought to this country in slavery, and immigrants as well. Racism meshed perfectly with a long-held Christian anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic beliefs and practices. Thus, the toxic roots of both fear and hatred of Jews and Blacks grew from the same ground of beliefs about inferior and superior races. Sadly, my dissertation missed all of those multifaceted connections. It was written in the zeitgeist of an accepted narrative about race, nationalism, and nation in the idealization of white Anglo-Saxon history. My story was about Jews wanting to be part of the American nation. But the fuller, more accurate history could not just be about anti-Semitism. Today, it would have to include colonialism and broad-based racial hierarchies. Fortunately, in the past decades, there has been a proliferation of scholarly literature about the disastrous impact of 19th and 20th century racial ideologies and policies. Significant studies now document the global scale of race-based immigration restriction. And these include works, The Gods of the Upper Air by Charles King, and Defending the Master Race by Jonathan Spiro, and Drawing the Global Color Line by Marilyn Lake and Henry Reynolds. Also, The Science and Politics of Racial Research by William Tucker, and The Color of Empire, Race and American Foreign Relations by Michael Krenn. I've been speaking in generalities, but let me turn to some specific similarities and differences between the struggles of the American Civil Rights Movement, which continue today, racism in Europe, and the rise of nationalism. On both sides of the Atlantic, we're confronting the lasting impact of colonialism, focused on Black and Brown people, as well as Indigenous peoples, which revolved around race, money, armies, and territorial expansion. The US and Europe also share the legacy of hostility towards Jews. It was a fundamental aspect of Christianity, expressed through powerful religious narratives, rituals, and iconography, including master paintings and grotesque caricatures. Over centuries, the suspicions and anger towards Jews was realized through restrictions on Jewish life, violence, and expulsions from various countries. The eugenics movement intensified the traditional hatred of Jews by castigating them as a dangerous and infected race. This combination of religious and racial fears, hatred, and obsessions culminated in the convulsions of the Second World War and the Holocaust. Germany plunged into racial madness from the late 1920s until 1945. From 1939 to 1945, Germany imposed its fascist power and racist beliefs, in small part modeled after Jim Crow laws, and fashioned them for the rest of Europe. Expulsions of Jews were no longer enough. Annihilation was necessary and required. As a result, 6 million Jews died. The mission was accomplished relatively fast. Post-war Europe was essentially rid of its Jewish population, or its Jewish problem, and its population. And in the aftermath of the Second World War, eugenics was out. Racism couldn't be openly admitted or used as a policy once the democracies brought Germany to overwhelming defeat. Employed against Jews, a racial problem was taken care of. They were gone, murdered. Few Jews remained in Europe. Many went to Israel and to the US. The Western world held Germany responsible for the genocide, although other European countries played their sinister roles. Thus, Germany forbade using the word race or openly tolerating racist ideologies and parties. Human rights were deified over many decades. So this is the tidy part, so to speak. But in the post-war years, Europe also started to disentangle itself from its colonial holdings in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. In regard to Europe's other racial issues, each of the former colonial powers has had to deal with the sudden presence of those who migrated to the colonial mother country. Indonesians and Surinamese to the Netherlands, Algerians, Moroccans, and Tunisians to France, and from many former African colonies, and Indians and Pakistanis, and those from the Caribbean to England. At home on national ground, bathed in nationalist stories, Europe found itself confronting former colonial subjects who had always been regarded in racial terms of inferiority and difference. Europe had claimed global ownership of so-called inferior people. But the colonies were out there, useful for profit, power, and journeys to manhood for the restless men at home and their dutiful wives and families. It's important to recognize that race was way out of sight in the mother countries until the German Nazi state converted nationalism into race hatred across the continent. In the aftermath of the war, Europe couldn't escape the post-Holocaust shadows of racial inequity along with greater diversity. And now Europe is being held accountable for the myriad horrors of colonialism. And while the US saved Europe from itself in the Second World War, the US hit its own totalitarian and racist reality. It had lived with that reality for over 400 years. The country was a practicing racist society within its own borders, filled with diabolical racial laws and policies. America's sense of Anglo-Saxon white superiority was made to justify a constructive narrative of nationalism, forging the ever-expanding frontier for settlers, eradicating Native American life on vast portions of the continent to make room for those looking for wealth and democracy, American exceptionalism, the city on the hill, manifest destiny that brought Hawaii and Cuba and the Philippines and other islands into the US orbit of imperialism. And finally, climatically, in the 1950s, the moral, ideological, superior, and military leader of the world. The counter story is that for over nearly 300 years, Blacks have been trying to free themselves and ourselves of this racism and hypocritical denial about democracy and justice. The civil rights movement was a monumental undertaking with heroic achievements. It tested the power of racism and found, not surprisingly, that racism would continue to fight back. The Trump administration, over 100 years after the Civil War, provided opportunities for renewed racial-based power with executive approval from the White House itself. In desperate attempts to sustain racism and deny the realization of an inclusive democracy and pluralism, opposition forces have recently brought the country to the edge of disaster. On January 6, 2021 was the outbreak of a new kind of civil war. In these more hopeful Biden times, we are very much in the midst of a battle over democracy and social equity. I'm hopeful for America, despite, as well as because of its aspirations for democratic fulfillment. I'm less confident about Europe. Fortress Europe is unsteady and in many respects unwilling to figure out how to confront race and colonialism. Right-wing parties throughout the continent are building power on nationalist racial platforms. Center and left-oriented European parties seek new formulations of democracy will diminish the forces of racism, but they too operate in the grip of fear of more immigration from Africa and the Middle East, fear of Islam challenging Christian and secular Europe, and fear that the more radical attempts at racial reconciliation in the US will shake European societies as well. In forging a new American nationalism, America has created a flood of academic studies and ideologies focused on race, forces of protest, such as Black Lives Matter, myriad initiatives on the ground to increase social justice. European countries are watching us, and we are watching ourselves. Will America's long-delayed confrontation with its racial history succeed? Will it allow extreme anti-democratic forces to impose violence in the exercise of political participation? Will America be able to assert leadership in global affairs after the isolationist policies of the last administration? Will America in Biden times drive Europe's encounter with its own racism and national narratives? We cannot know, but the two continents remain tied together by their race-based pasts, their national aspirations, and attempts at global leadership.
So yesterday we talked, in part one of this event, we looked at the power of individuals during the American Civil Rights Movement, when the justice system tried to make change, but society didn't comply. Individuals at the local levels were not abiding by the law, essentially, that had been set by the Supreme Court. Does it appear to you that these practices, such as you mentioned, forbidding the word race, are those making an impact? Where do you see that change has to be driven from?
Well, I think the change has to be driven by our confrontation with ourselves and our recognition of what is at stake. Historically, what has transpired is that the civil rights movement essentially put into action, not only by the protests, which were extraordinary and heroic, but then by the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, who said, essentially, we simply have to do this. And at the same time, he said, as he signed the laws, he said, this is probably the end of the Democratic Party and its power. And what we saw taking place was the move to, for the South, essentially to switch from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And the South became the part of the country that resisted, and the North as well, by the way, and certainly northern cities went through traumatic experiences in resisting desegregation. The North was, in terms of education and even in terms of residential policies, as segregated, and in some cases even more segregated than the South. But the South as an entity felt that its education system had to be changed. And the political party that made that change effective was the Republican Party. So you have a complete change in the constitution of the political debates. That reaction took a long time to really settle in, but it has been effective. I would say that I think the Obama presidency was the high point of the expectation that we could move beyond this past, but it also created an even more intense backlash, which we saw in the Trump administration. And we saw something that we had never seen before, really, in a long, long time, which was a approval, a kind of, a testing of racial confrontation and resistance, and the approval of a narrative of patriotism that was profoundly exclusionary and left no opening for the mobility that's needed to make a more equitable society.
Okay.
So it's a very complicated history, and we are playing it out today in many, many different forms and areas, and it's not clear exactly what's going to result from this.
Mm-hmm.
Tom Friedman had a piece in the Times 2 days ago, which was pretty strong, in which he said, "Big lie devours GOP and eyes our democracy." So what is at stake is not just the culture living with a residue of racism, but it's also the democracy which is at stake.
Great. Thank you. And so in your conclusion, you mentioned a little bit about your hope for the U.S. to improve and decrease its racist practices and tendencies and really come to terms with our history. But can you explain a little bit more about why you are less optimistic about Europe changing? What differences make Europe less ready to confront racism and colonialism?
I think the reason for that is that they, first of all, they've been very reluctant to recognize the colonial past. The disassociation from the colonies, which went through many iterations, some peaceful and some very much violent, confrontation and wars. Europe has sort of said that's way in the past. The problem in Europe is that it is a continent that really doesn't know how to adapt to immigration. It's a continent that exported its populations and maintained its global superiority by its colonial holdings. But the racial issues in Europe were, as I mentioned in the talk, were out there. And therefore, the pluralism didn't play out within the countries themselves. It did under the fascists, when the Jews were perceived to be the racist threat. But the Black threat, the African threat, essentially it was elsewhere, it was out of sight. The only time that it was brought close to home was during war, when England and France needed Black soldiers to fight, for example. So Europe develops after the Second World War with an enormous sense, or not such enormous sense, we don't know, of guilt for having done what was really incredibly hideous and awful. It signs on to human rights. It also goes through from 45 to 49, essentially a period of ethnic cleansing or national cleansing, in which the countries take back populations that had gotten mixed up into other countries. And so Poland becomes much more Polish and Ukrainian, and the Czechs export the Germans. And by 49, these national entities are rather satisfied with who they are. I mean, there's the Iron Curtain and the communists and all of that, but essentially as ethnic bodies, they're okay. and they know what their history, however convoluted, has been, but they know essentially that their nationalism is something that they can, partake in. Mm-hmm. And then you have Europe never expecting again to be pluralistic, because the Jews are gone. The blacks were never there. Islam had been kept out. And then you have the need for labor. And labor is invited in, the Turks and others, Moroccans and others, invited into Europe in the 60s, 50s and 60s, and they're expected to go home. They're guest workers. They're to do the work and leave. And in 1972, we have a big recession, and the guest workers don't go home because the European systems are very nice with benefits and employment and all the rest. And then you have, for the first time, the beginning, you have family reunions and the beginning of second and third generations. So then Europe is subject to becoming a more and more plural set of pluralistic societies. And Europe is not prepared to deal with that. And for many, many years, it's just simply a situation of neglect. They don't exist. And then, of course, with the upheavals in the Middle East, you have migration of refugees. Europe was, after the Second World War, very willing to take refugees and asylum seekers because they owed it after what they had done in the Second World War. But it became very complicated. And now a country like Denmark, which, by the way, was the most protective country in all of Europe of its Jewish population, it saved its Jewish population. That country now is sending Syrian refugees who have been in Denmark for many, many years, who are integrated in employment and in the country, sending them back because it does not want to have ever-growing refugee populations. We in this country, of course, are experiencing the same thing. Immigration is very hard to deal with. So Europe is very frightened that there'll be massive immigration with climate change and other economic and economic changes, that it will be subject to large-scale migration from Africa and from the Middle East. And the distance between Europe and the African continent and the Middle East is not very great. So they are presented with having to think of themselves as being pluralistic countries at the same time that they want desperately to hone to their own nationalism. And you see that in France at this point in particular, in terms of the Islamic population, which is large, 6 million, and not very happy to be put in conditions of sort of secondary citizenship. And then the point I raised before is that Europe is afraid that it's going to be affected in its dealings with multiple or diverse populations. It's going to be affected by the American conversation about race. And we saw that beginning to happen this summer when the Black Lives Matter movement just caught fire in European countries.
Julie's asking that she's looking for a role model country to emulate. Is there any society that you have noticed that successfully and earnestly embraced immigrants, or at least tolerated them well and incorporated them into society?
I think that the American system is capable of doing what almost no other country has done. If you look at Australia, it has its indigenous populations, Canada the same. All of these countries were vastly hostile to Jews. And we could look at Jews as an example of an immigrant population trying to break through a Christian society and being rejected. But I think America has deep ties to its beliefs that it can be a democratic country and an inclusive country, and partially because the Black population has said, you've got to do it. So while we have the enormous challenge, I must say, I don't think any country is doing better than we. Mm-hmm. And we have probably one of the greatest challenges, but I think we also have the capacity to be a diverse and reasonably equitable society.
I agree. And I also think that last night's speaker, Charles Person, the freedom writer, would have agreed with you also. He said, we're not perfect, but I have a lot of faith in the future of where America can go. So I think that was a great conclusion. I thank you so much for this conversation. I learned a lot. I hope you all did as well. I don't want to conclude this without first mentioning that Judith and I are both white women. I certainly recognize the privilege that we have in leading a conversation like this. And I just want to say that this is an exploration. This is one exploration of racism. I encourage all of you guys to please continue educating yourselves, incorporating as much just new knowledge as you can about these issues as often as possible. If you keep learning, that's how we can keep progressing. So thank you all for joining, and we're going to continue to practice our allyship the best ways that we know how. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. Have a great night. Bye, Judith.
Bye, thank you.